human relationship and human understanding. That is true. Here, the doctors, if they can devote time to literature, do have an advantage, is that they may be able to look inside the minds of a man in a better way than possibly untrained persons. Because doctors are by profession trained to observe. There are some profession who are trained to observe the smallest changes in nuances, expressions, everything. And from that, they draw their inferences. Now we have very eminent panelists, and I'm great. It feels great to be with doctor writers, though I have told, but that doctor and literature doesn't have any special relationship other than others, but still it feels good, na? When you belong to the same tribe. So, Aarti will be speaking first. So we speak about 8 to 9 minutes. First, everyone, one by one, and then we'll have a panel discussion kind of thing. So we start.
Thank you so much, sir. I'm actually a bit overwhelmed to be here because, as sir rightly said, all my life, only thing I knew about was teaching patients and treating patients. So that was the only thing, I think that was the only identity I actually believed I had. I never thought I'll be representing as a writer over here. So I think, like sir said, probably there's, is there any speciality that doctors becoming writers? But I think for time immemorial, if you read the books, which the way the body was described, the way the history of medicine has evolved, it's always been so narrative and so interesting. You can understand it better when you're actually reading it in the form of a story. And if you look at just Gray's Anatomy, which is our first year of MBBS, we read a book. So it is so descriptive. So, and I used to wonder, the book is this huge, and how did someone have time to write that kind of book? We are used to small books, you know, reading notes and, you know, all that. But somebody would describe one nerve in such a detail. So somewhere it stuck with me that, you know, I stuck to reading those monograms, that is specific authors, big books, which we didn't have to do. We could just read short notes and all that. But their description is what always caught my attention. So in medicine, I think it is more like narrative medicine, that, you know, we narrate a sort of story in the, you know, the patient is no longer a patient, it's his story, it's basically his life story. So that, keeping that in mind, when I'm a general physician, internal medicine, I've done MD medicine, so I started thinking I'm Sherlock Holmes. So every case, there is something to diagnose, right? I believe in diagnosing complex cases. I like when they come with big files and I need to find out what it is. So I started writing in the form of, again, a narrative medicine. It was more of medical blogs where I would become the Sherlock Holmes and, you know, diagnose something and put it in a very detective form. And somehow my readers, at that point I probably posted on Facebook, shared my blog post. This was probably 10 years ago. When I just finished my MD medicine is when I started the medical blog. So when I started writing, I realized people enjoyed that form of narrative medicine. And at the same time, we were tackling one more information, that is some misinformation which is there. So we were telling stories of patients, but also teaching them a small thing, you know, this is a possibility. So I enjoyed doing that for quite a bit of time. But then, as I started writing, I realized there is this detective medicine also is not something, probably I'm doing it for as my show off. Maybe I'm bragging it, I'm telling people, see, I diagnosed this, or, you know, it was becoming more of that, I realized. But there's so much of human dimensions which we want to cover when we are writing something. I think it's not about diagnosing about the patient, it's not. When I started writing more and more, I realized I didn't want to write about the medical aspect at all. I wanted to write more about my helplessness in the form of loss. When I see a loss, how do I describe that helplessness? Or when the patient comes in that helpless state, how do I describe that emotion to them? And so it had become from narrative medicine to some sort of human dimensions I wanted to cover. A small story here, we had a 60-year-old gentleman. He was a police inspector and he developed a stroke. Now that stroke was in a small part of brain called pons, pontine stroke. He was otherwise fine, it recovered faster, everything was fine. But he couldn't swallow because of that small infarct in the pons. So what happened was we realized, I know he's fine. He's somebody who's been a police inspector all his life. He was not dependent on anybody. But here he is depending on everyone else and he's unable to swallow and, these emotions which... So after 2-3 weeks, after consistent visits, when he came to my OPD, and probably this was 4 weeks after his discharge, when he was able to swallow and we gave him sips of water, then he gulped some more. Then he took some more. Probably he had 3 glasses of water with tears pouring down. And everybody in the OPD, we had tears in our eyes. It was such a joyful moment, as if a mother is, seeing her child eat for the first time. So that's the sort of human dimensions is what I started bringing out in my blogs. Unfortunately, for reasons because like sir already said, I think lack of time, we get busy with our things and not able to write them more frequently. I stopped. And then then I encountered something very different in my own personal life. I lost my husband 3 years ago. Then suddenly all grief struck me, and I didn't know how to express it out, or, this was as being on the other end of the patient, like if I was the attender of the patient, here I was helpless myself. That's where being a doctor versus being a caregiver, I was his caregiver for a good 2 years before he passed away. So being a caregiver versus being a doctor and witnessing the helplessness and all that I witnessed had to come out some way. And the only reason I say I'm alive today is because I started writing poetry. It was sort of emotional catharsis for me. I didn't know it existed in me that I could express such deep emotions in the form of poetry. So that's when this poetry journey actually began. Then I saw that there's more and more, like 2 things, like we are talking about being a doctor and being a writer. If being a doctor keeps me sane, it feeds me, but I'm alive because I write poetry, I read poetry, I think middle of the night, I would just get up and read some poems and I would feel so much better, like somebody knows what this pain is. So I think that's what literature does. So whichever profession you are in, I think to exist, to be alive, I think literature is what takes us forward. So now poetry, I've written multiple poems on the womb, how the child grows, if it's a twin, how it is. I have written a poem called Divine Womb. My father underwent a very complex cardiac procedure. Then I looked at how those arteries would look, brought it into a fountain of youth. I wrote a poem. Then I realized just the human body and the human dimensions of emotions can be brought in such a beautiful way of literature. So, not taking up much time, and I want to discuss and learn and, learn from others too. So this has been my journey, and poetry and, being a doctor, all these together and giving a platform where I can talk about both the things together makes me feel so good, and I'm really overwhelmed. Thank you, Sahitya Academy and the government. Thank you, Rajmohan sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Feelings and how it translated into literature and how it brought a human dimension to your life which you thought never existed before possibly. So we have with us Brijesh, who is a professor of medicine, but he is known more for his plays, his dramas, than being a professor in Delhi, a professor of medicine in Delhi. So I'd like him to talk about his experience as a doctor writer and what difference does it make.
Thanks, Dr. Dhruv, and thank you, Sahitya Academy, for giving me this opportunity. I will speak in Hindi and English mix, basically, because I write in Hindi and you're speaking here English because there are people from other languages here as well. So I'll start with an excerpt from a very well-known play. And this excerpt is titled Occupational Disease. And as for the physicians, the state gives them positions and pays them so much a piece. Their job is to keep mending the bits the police keeps sending, then send it all back to the police. This is the beginning of occupational disease, piece in Bertolt Brecht's Fear and Miseries in Third Reich, a play he had written during the Nazi Germany. And we see a patient being brought in and he's bandaged all over, and people ask, what has he got? What has he got? And nobody answers, and then the surgeon walks in. And surgeon says, gentlemen, we have here a quite beautiful case showing how essential it is to ask questions and keep on searching for the deeper cause of the disease if medicine is not to degenerate into mere quackery. This patient has all the symptoms of neuralgia, and for a considerable time he received the appropriate treatment. In fact, however, he suffers from Raynaud's disease, which he contracted in the course of his job as a worker operating pneumatically powered tools. There is to say, gentlemen, occupational disease. There are three things a good doctor has to be able to do. What are they? The first, ask questions, says the first attendant. Second, ask questions. Third, ask questions. So that's how we conduct a round with few pages behind us and the boss pontificating. And so when I read this scene as a student of not medicine but of drama, so I thought, oh gosh, this is what we do all the time. And in the end, the doctor, this professor, is not willing to ask questions from this patient who has been brought from a Nazi concentration camp, because all the injuries that he has got are because of the torture that he has faced at the hand of Nazis, and the doctor doesn't want to offend the Nazis. So that's the statement. That's the statement which is not given by a doctor as a writer. That was being Brecht. But that made an immense impact on me. And I also read many doctors who were writers, like A.J. Cronin I read at the age of 11, at the age of 17 or so. And Chekhov, I read many plays by Chekhov, and Somerset Maugham, and Stanislaw Lem. These were all great writers. They were but they were doctors as well. How much of their profession they brought into the plays or the stories that they have written? I feel, and that's where Dr. Dhruv Jyoti is, I agree with him, that a doctor is a doctor and he's writing as well. So that's it's not, but he has got one capacity. That is that he has this capacity to observe, because he's been trained to do that. And not only observe the symptoms, but also to understand the symptom and reach a diagnosis, reach an etiology of what is happening. What does this symptom mean? I see in my hospital people who are in misery, who are in pain. A van comes with food, they are distributing food, and so many people line up. And they are eating taking food because it's being given free. And we say that we have developed, we have no starvation in this country. And what is this happening? So I asked this question to myself. This question is not a question from medical perspective, in the sense that I am not looking at a patient and making a diagnosis on that and putting that into a story, but I'm looking at what is happening around me and then applying my observation skills and my diagnostic skill to this society. So it's not only that साहित्य समाज का दर्पण है, किसी ने कहा था, but it's also दर्पण जो है उसमें जो प्रतिबिंब दिखता है वो प्रतिबिंब होता है, वो बिल्कुल हूबहू नहीं होता, वो उसको दिखलाने की कोशिश भी करता है. तो ये बात है. और ऐसे ही दौर के अंदर जब मैंने कई नाटक लिखे हैं, लेकिन पिछले दिनों जब कोविड का समय आया तो उस वक़्त जिस किस्म का माहौल था, नाटक कविता लिखना ऐसे लग रहा था एक लग्जरी है. सुबह से लेकर शाम तक हम लोगों के पास जाने कितने फ़ोन आते थे. कई बार मैं बहुत बड़े अस्पताल में हूँ जो कि कोविड का मेजर सेंटर था दिल्ली के अंदर, लेकिन कई दफ़ा मुमकिन नहीं हो पाता था किसी को बेड दिलवा पाना, किसी को इलाज करवा पाना. और ऐसे के अंदर समय के अंदर किस किस्म की क्रिएटिविटी हो, ये बात कई दफ़ा दिमाग में आती थी. तो एक कविता जो उन दिनों लिखी, सोचता हूँ इन दिनों कविता होनी चाहिए प्यार पे. माना कि बहुत है आपदा त्रासदी, दुख पीड़ा और मौत, पर कविता तो होनी चाहिए प्यार पे. बहुत ज़रूरत है प्यार की इन दिनों, लड़ने के लिए इन सब से. माना कि बहुत है किल्लत ऑक्सीजन की, दवा की, बिस्तर की, पर कविता तो होनी चाहिए प्यार पे, बेशुमार प्यार पे. कम से कम उसकी तो ना हो किल्लत. माना कि हर रोज़ खबर आती है बिछड़ जाने की, किसी जाने अनजाने अपने पराए दोस्त दुश्मन की, पर कविता तो होनी चाहिए प्यार पे, रूहानी प्यार पे. यादों का सरमाया वही तो है जो रह जाता है. माना कि शासक है क्रूर, त्रासदी में भी नफरत फैलाने वाले या अधिक से अधिक त्रासदी के प्रति उदासीन, पर कविता तो होनी चाहिए प्यार पे, इंसानी प्यार पे. सद्भाव को दुनिया बदलने की यही तो है उम्मीद. पर उतार नहीं पाता हूं कागज पे प्यार की कविता. प्यार ऑक्सीजन तो नहीं, ना ही दवा, ना बिस्तर, न खत्म कर सकता है मौत महामारी को. शासकों के नुमाद, उदासीनता, क्रूरता का भी नहीं ये इलाज. ये होता तो वो होते ही क्यों. एक खला जो रह जाती है यादों से भर नहीं पाती है. प्यार इंसानी, जिस्मानी, रूहानी, जज्बाती, हाथ तो थाम सकता है, पर बस उतना ही. प्यार ज़रूरी तो है मुस्तकबिल बदलने को, पर इन दिनों का क्या करें. शब से उतरा मखमली गुलाबी परिधान कोमल तो है, पर जिस्म पर नहीं ओढ़ा जाता, नहीं पैदा करता रोमांच. चाहता तो हूँ प्यार की कविता लिखना, पर कागज़ पर उतरती ही नहीं. फिर भी कविता तो होनी चाहिए प्यार पे. शुक्रिया.
थैंक यू सर. जैसा कि ध्रुव जी ने कहा भी है कि चिकित्सक जब साहित्य रचता है तो वो किस दृष्टि से रचता है ये बहुत महत्वपूर्ण होता है. इंजीनियर की दृष्टि अलग होती है. तो आप एक हाथी को देख सकते हैं, हर व्यक्ति अपने दृष्टिकोण से देखता है. और जब कोई चिकित्सक साहित्य रचता है तो जैसा ब्रजेश जी ने भी कहा कि जहाँ हर तरफ मौत का साया हो, जहाँ हर तरफ चुनौतियाँ हो, वहाँ जब बताया आरती जी ने कि कैसे उम्मीद पल्लवित होती है, कैसे हम सकारात्मकता की तरफ देखते हैं, तब शायद प्यार की कविता लिखने की ज़रूरत होती है. अब मैं बहुत सम्मान के साथ जिन्हें आमंत्रित करना चाहता हूँ वे अभिजीत तरफदार. बिगेन टू राइट शॉर्ट स्टोरीज इन द बंगाली मैगजीन देश सिंस 1993. His first novel Mahajagtik was serialized in the Bengali magazine Patrika in 1997, which has later come out as a book form, for which he received a Sutapa Roy Chaudhary Memorial Award for Bengal Academy. Since then, he has published nearly 20 novels and more than 100 short stories in Bengali. his short stories, Sankatkaran, was included in the anthology of the short stories published by the Sahitya Akademi. संकटकरण में हमने कई सारी ऐसी कहानियाँ पढ़ी है जिनका ट्रांसलेशन पढ़ने का मुझे मौका मिला था. तो वे जीवन की जो आप जिन्हें हम आपदाएं कहते हैं, कैसे वे सकारात्मक रूप में भी सामने आ सकती है, वो साहित्य की दृष्टि से ही दिखाई देता है. मैं बड़े सम्मान के साथ अभिजीत जी को आमंत्रित करता हूँ.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Chairperson. Thank you, Coordinator. The topic here is literature, doctor prescribed. A doctor doesn't prescribe literature. Rather, literature blooms in his practice every day, every moment. And it is the responsibility of the doctor, a sensible doctor, to feel it and pen it. Sometimes he does, sometimes he can, sometimes he doesn't, sometimes he's unable to do that. I'll share with you rather some anecdotes. A 20-year-old young married lady came to us with a 60-year-old man who was her husband. Husband was suffering from kidney failure and he was in need of kidney transplantation. And this lady was the prospective donor. 20-year-old lady donating one of her kidneys to a 60-year-old husband. As doctors, it was our responsibility to get an informed consent. It is not consent, it is informed consent. So we took her to the next room and interrogated. She immediately broke down and said, after the kidney is being donated, marriage will be annulled, she will be sent back to her native place, to her ailing parents. Of course, some money will exchange hands. This is one story. A story is born. But by this 20 years, the world has changed. Even she couldn't identify her husband because in her memory, the husband was a 40-year-old young man. And now he's 60. He has aged. Now she couldn't cope with the changed environment, the changed world. And she uttered to her daughter, I wish to lose my vision once again. Another story is born. When a doctor treats a patient, excuse me, that patient comes to him with not only his or her physical wounds, the wounds he or she derives from the society, from the family, in its entirety. So, as Sir was saying, a doctor is privileged because the patient comes to him bare, naked, exposes all her maladies, pangs, wounds. He is able to assess those, and if possible, he can pen those. Similarly, to a doctor, various things, they change their definition. As for example, truth. Truth, is it absolute? As for example, I give you an example. A patient, a dying patient, holds the hand of the doctor and says, am I going to leave? There are two answers. One is in absolute term, that is absolute truth. No, you are not going to leave. And there is another truth. He can console him and he may say, no, there are so many options. You are definitely going to leave, maybe another 20, 25 years. That is another truth which in truest term may not be truth, but it is a truth derived from the doctor's experience. So the definition of truth changes in a doctor's practice. Similarly, a doctor, while treating a patient, actually he fights with somebody, someone which is very strong. and that is nothing but death. While fighting death, he derives from this concept of death just the opposite meaning which lies opposite to death, and that is life. And then, once again, his love for life ultimately blossoms into something which may or may not be literature. I will end up with another story, and I'll finish with that only. This also was an experience of mine when I was working. I am a nephrologist, but at the time I was working in a health center. One lady, mother of four, all female children, came to us being pregnant, going to deliver her fifth child. She delivered. And the nursing staff, this is the practice, the nursing staff came to that lady with the baby in her lap. Please look at her and say whether it's a male child or a female child. Her 4 previous children were all female. And the story behind is, this time the husband has sent her to her in-laws' place, rather to her mother, because mother was the only person in her in-laws' house, with the condition that if you deliver a male child this time, then you will be taken back to my family. Otherwise, you have to stay with your mother eternally. I am not going to take you back. I remember that this lady who has just delivered a baby, she closed her eyes and went on uttering, I know it's a male, I know it's a male child. But the way the sister was telling, she could understand this was once again a female child. And she screamed and said, you have exchanged my baby with someone else's baby, and that was my child was a male child. You have exchanged it with someone else's baby. So I have this time given birth to a male child. And this is the way a doctor sees how stories blossom. The program that we are participating, the meaning of UNMESH is to blossom, to bloom, to generate. And when a doctor practices, he realizes that stories do bloom, do generate, do blossom every now and then. He tries to pen down those stories, but whether those stories are true literature or not, that's a totally different question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, visit. It is very nice the way you have presented the various experiences today practice and how in the common everyday practice looms the seeds of literature, sometimes of very eternal and universal literature lies there. And in this, possibly I will say the doctor does have a small advantage, isn't it?
You said all disadvantages, advantage.
Small advantage is there that I can get, but he has to have that ability to toil and love for literature to translate it into writing. So we were supposed to have somebody online. She's there, I know. Online?
Suretra ji, no connection.
Nahi hoga na? Nothing. So we have
Kaveri Nammesan ji.
Kaveri Nammesan. She is a lady from Kurk into the doctor profession as well as into the social arena as well. So I would request her to speak. You can introduce.
Yeah. जैसा कि सर ने अभी बताया, कावेरी नंबिसन जी अपनी इन दिनों एक जो बहुचर्चित पुस्तक है अ लग्जरी कार्ड हेल्थ, उसके लिए चर्चा में हैं। आप कर्नाटक से हैं, परिचय में बताया गया है, लेकिन आपने बिहार, यूपी, तमिलनाडु के ग्रामीण क्षेत्रों में काम किया है। आप पेशे से सर्जन है, बाल साहित्य भी लिखती हैं, लेकिन जो इनका यह संस्मरण की जिस किताब की मैं बात कर रहा हूँ, अ लग्जरी कार्ड हेल्थ, जो हम लोगों के लिए भी स्वस्थ रहना सबसे बड़ी नियामत जो कहा जाता है, उस लग्जरी को जब अभी हम बात कर रहे थे, अभिजीत सर ने बताया कि कैसे चिकित्सक बीमारियों से लड़ते हुए, जो सबसे ज़्यादा स्ट्रॉन्ग एनिमी है डेथ, उससे लड़ते हुए चमत्कार रच देते हैं टेबल पर। वैसे ही हमने कावेरी जी के इस जो ये संस्मरण है, इसमें देखा है कि ग्रामीण इलाकों में स्वास्थ्य सेवाओं के जो संकट है, संसाधनों की कमी है, उस कमी से जूझते हुए कैसे चिकित्सक चमत्कार रच देते हैं। और ये जो पूरी यात्रा है, संस्मरण की यात्रा है, ये कला के जरिए, मेडिकल के जो इथिक्स हैं उसके जरिए इन्होंने लिखी है। मैं सम्मान के साथ में कावेरी जी को आमंत्रित करता हूँ कि वे आएँ और अपनी बात रखें।
Respected Chairperson, dear doctors and dear friends. Yes, I am a doctor and a writer, so I thought, we do use those in our storytelling. May not be directly, but they do permeate our stories. They do come into our stories, then the people we meet, the people we see, and the conditions we see them in. But how about literature affecting our work? How about the act of writing affecting the medical work? I was very surprised because lots of people always ask me at conferences, so you are, being a doctor, it must be easy for you to write, or does it influence your writing? And do your characters come from patients? These things they ask you about your novels. But only once a person asked me, how much has your writing influenced your medical, your surgical work? And I really did not have an answer. I was quite taken aback by that question because I had not thought of it. And so I did say that please let me think about it because I haven't actually given it any thought. And later, it was playing in the back of my mind, and I have come to realize that perhaps writing has affected my work as a doctor more than the other way around. Because writing taught me, I don't know how to say it. I must go back to when I started writing. I started writing for women, for women's magazines, and that was really very superficial writing. I was doing fluffy, romantic stories, and I was not happy with them at all. But I just wanted to be, just to write. But then I started writing for children. And when I started writing for children, I realized that you need to be honest when you write for children. Your voice will come out clear, true, because children will not, they can, what I mean, you can't just moralize them, you can't talk down to them. So I think children taught me how to write, that thing of hearing your own voice and not talking with someone I understood by writing for children. And then I went on to writing adult novels. But I have constantly thought that the amount of reading I have been doing because of writing, the way I read books is different to the way I did before I started to write. I love reading poetry and plays as much as I love reading fiction because they teach me a lot and they move me. I don't get a chance to watch plays because I live in rural areas most of the time, but I read a lot of plays. And poetry I read. So what I find is that one of the questions every good writer seems to ask in the end is why, or how, not why, but how do we live? How do we live? I think that is the question almost every big major work seems to ask, seems to have at the heart of it is how do we live? What is the purpose of this life? You know, that comes. And if you are a writer, if you've been writing, whatever you have been writing, if you're a serious writer, you are going to end up asking that question. So, and that helps to distill your thoughts and to always seek for that which will teach you how to live, you know. And that's actually a very big question. And so I feel the channel of communication for the writer is words. And the words, as we often find when we attend big conferences, that you can speak for half an hour, you can speak for a long time, and you might not say a single thing that is meaningful. You can talk platitudes, you can talk jargon, you can talk a lot of flowery things, but it may not really mean anything because it doesn't mean anything to you. And the communication to the listener has not happened. So whenever we speak, whenever we write, what we say has to have that type of what do you call it, a cleanness, a clean communication between the writer and the reader. And those channels of communication can get clogged by a lot of flowery language and overdoing something beyond the truth, you know, padding up. So these are points I found of great importance in my writing, and through my writing, I found that I was developing a certain better sensitivity towards my patients. I found that I was able to understand both myself, my own limitations as a doctor, as a surgeon, a person who had to work in very, very difficult situations. I found that is also helped the limitations you begin to understand of yourself better when you are also a writer, because you're going into the minds of different types of people. Literature helps to open up your mind to people who don't think like you, And in today's world particularly, I think we need more and more of wanting to understand people who are not like us, who are not like us. And this is important. So I think between a lot of people will also say, I'm sure you've all heard this, that which is more difficult? Is it more difficult to do your medical work, or is it more difficult to write? But that is an open question always. But so I think the challenges are strong on both sides. And perhaps at this critical point in the world, in society today, literature holds a very, very strong, very, very crucial and important role. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaveri. You have
tend to towards literature while being doctors. I think that's one similarity I identify the most while writing, because it's a journey within ourselves while we write. So doctor is a Latin word to teach. Actually, I don't think more than teaching, while we write, we learn about ourselves. I think that's what I like about it. Thank you, sir.
So, Abhijit, in your writings, in your novels, have you given yourself to a specific trend? Say, just people say that he writes about the subaltern, he writes about the marginalized. Do you have any such thing you would like to describe yourself, or like to write in the future?
Yes. First of all, I would respond to what Madam has raised that issue just in one or two sentences. For me, I also face the same question on several occasions, how there's a common perception that they possibly antagonize. To me, it's not. Rather, they substantiate it. And when I write, it's some sort of catharsis. I purge whatever pain I had collected, accumulated the whole day, that wanes. And then once again, the next morning, I go back to my practice energized. So to me, my literary habit or whatever, hard. And regarding sir's question, no, I don't want to conform to a specific pattern. Each time when I write a novel or a story, I make it a point, and as he has said, I don't go into this specific pattern like subaltern or something like that. At that point of time, whatever comes to my mind, emulate whatever I have created before. That's the only point I keep in mind.
Why do you write plays?
Why do I write plays? Well, I am part of a theatre group, and as Kaveri ji said, that for her, writing is a very personal process. With the theatre group, would know that when a play is created, it's created as a team.